Here we're going to look at the organization of whole skeletal muscles. Now, each skeletal muscle is an organ because it has tissue types other than muscle tissue within it. So it contains things like the muscle fibers, these are the cells of the muscle, nerves, blood vessels, and connective tissues as well. If we take a look at the nerves here, focus on the nerves for a second, one nerve is generally found within each whole muscle. And that nerve then branches into multiple nerve endings that control each individual muscle cell within that muscle. So that means that this one nerve is making synapses or junctions with every single individual skeletal muscle cell within that whole muscle. So in this diagram, we see the whole skeletal muscle, the skeletal muscle cells here, which are called muscle fibers. And these skeletal muscle fibers are bundled together with several other muscle fibers to form a fascicle. The plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell is called the sarcolemma. And we can't actually see it in this diagram, but it would be surrounding this muscle fiber here. And covering this sarcolemma, again, another structure we can't see in this diagram, is a connective tissue that's called endomysium. And endomysium is a very delicate wrapping around each individual skeletal muscle cell, and it's made out of areolar connective tissue. So essentially it's a soft connective tissue that's providing a place for things like blood vessels to occupy that space surrounding each individual skeletal muscle cell. So it's kind of bringing blood vessels in close proximity to each individual muscle cell or fiber. So the fascicles, or the bundles of skeletal muscle cells, are held together with a wrapping of paramecium. And paramecium is a dense, irregular connective tissue that essentially helps keep the fascicle organized. Finally, looking at the whole skeletal muscle, we see another connective tissue layer wrapping its more superficial surface called the epimysium. And the epimysium is also a dense irregular connective tissue similar to the paramecium. And its job is really just to help organize all of the fascicles within that skeletal muscle. So the epimysium and the paramecium and endomysium, for that matter, are continuous with the tendons that anchor the muscle to the bone. So essentially all of these connective tissue wrappings form a collective bundle that then terminate at a tendon, which anchors that muscle to the bone that it attaches to. So that's it for the connective tissue wrappings and things like that. Now let's take a closer look at the muscle fiber, aka the muscle cell, right? So this diagram shows one individual muscle cell, or part of one muscle cell here. And what we're seeing, this delicate external wrapping here, this is the sarcolemma, which we didn't see in that previous diagram here. Remember, the sarcolemma is the term that we use for the skeletal muscle cell plasma membrane. So remember that the fiber or the cell, it's a cell just like any other cell, so it has to have this plasma membrane associated with it. Also within it, we see kind of the usual complement of organelles. We see the nuclei. Remember that skeletal muscles have multiple nuclei. They are multinucleate. And we also see an abundance of mitochondria in them. And we have to have an abundance of mitochondria in skeletal muscles because they require lots of ATP when they're active. One of the things we don't see in this diagram, and they don't label, I don't believe in any of the diagrams in your textbook, they simply talk about it, is this material that's called the sarcoplasm. And as you probably guessed, sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of the skeletal muscle cell. It occupies the space between the sarcolemma and the organelles that are inside of the skeletal muscle fiber. The sarcoplasm is pretty similar to the cytoplasm of other cells, but the one difference, or the kind of the key differences between sarcoplasm and cytoplasm in other cells, is that the sarcoplasm contains lots of glycogen granules. So remember, glycogen is a is a long chain of stored glucose that the cell can use as fuel to make ATP. Another thing that we also see in the sarcoplasm is a red pigment that's called myoglobin. And myoglobin is very similar to the hemoglobin that's in your blood. Its job is to bind and store oxygen in the skeletal muscle cells. The remainder of the organelles and materials that we see packed into this skeletal muscle fiber are these rod-like organelles called myofibrils. These are the contractile organelles, and often there are thousands of myofibrils per muscle cell. The myofibrils contain the contractile proteins and give the muscle its striated appearance. So we'll see in future lecture segments how the myofibril is organized and how it works to generate muscle contractions. So what we didn't see in the previous diagram is that they omitted, most likely for clarity, this web-like network of channels that surrounds each myofibril. And this network that you see here in blue is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR. The sarcoplasmic reticulum's job is to store calcium when the muscle is at rest. When the muscle is stimulated, the SR will release that calcium, and this increasing calcium within the muscle cell will cause that muscle to begin contracting. Also, what we see is that the sarcoplasmic reticulum expands a little bit at its ends where it butts up against this tube-like structure, which is called a T-tubule. Now, T-tubules are tunnels of plasma membrane. So remember that these are essentially just tunnels of the sarcolemma. And these tunnels extend down from the surface of the cell to the myofibrils. And we'll see why this configuration, why the muscle cells are configured in this way, and how this structure, or this configuration of parts, goes about leading to skeletal muscle contraction. Because all of this, the T-tubules, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the myofibrils all play a role in causing skeletal muscle contraction, and we'll see that here soon.